day will you heal us? This day will you bless us?
This day will you lift us, visit us for good.
This day prepare us to spread justice in your world. This day hear our cry. This day accept our prayer in mercy and favor.
This day support us with your righteous hand.
This day accept our prayer in mercy and favor. This day, this day.
This day will you heal us. This day will you bless us. This day will you lift us, visit us for good.
This day prepare us to spread justice in your world. This day hear our cry.
Welcome back and welcome to our second lecture in our Barton Clinton Gordey Lecture series. We are back with Dr. Robert P. Jones. Dr. Jones earned his Ph.D. in religion from our United Methodist-related Emory University, where our United Methodist Candler School of Theology resides as well. Dr. Jones grew up in the Southern Baptist tradition and earned his Master of Divinity degree from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas. Before starting his own research firm, he served as a college professor in Springfield, Missouri. All to say, he knows the territory around us. Currently, he resides in the Washington, D.C. area and leads the company he founded in 2009, Public Religion Research Institute. They do original research and analysis. They gather the data and make it available free to the public. Dr. Jones is author of several books. We will discuss aspects of two of those today. His description and analysis of demographic changes occurring in the United States under the 2016 title, The End of White Christian America, and his more recent title that brought him to my attention, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which was published in 2020. Welcome back, Dr. Jones, for the second session with us for our Barton Clinton Gordey Lecture Series of 2021. For those of you just tuning in, I am the Reverend David Wiggs, Senior Pastor at Boston Avenue United Methodist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I'll be serving as your host today. After a prayer, we will delve into American Christianity and racism in America today. I'll be using the prayer of St. Francis for our opening. Let us pray. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. Okay, so today, Dr. Jones, we're talking about American Christianity and racism in America. In about 100 days, we will come upon the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Houses, churches, and businesses were burned down that belonged to Black people. Some of these same homes and businesses were looted. Black people were killed, people disappeared, never to be heard from again. The city, nor the county, nor the state brought any perpetrators to justice, and no insurance claim was paid to those who lost so much. Tulsa still is grappling with how to deal with this today, 100 years later. Perhaps your book title is a place to start our conversation today. Would you please explain to us the title and how you see it relating to our journey in America today?
Sure. Well, thanks, first of all, for having me back. I'm glad to be here and continue the conversation with you and with your congregation and those others that are joining us probably from across the country. So, yeah, I'll start with the title, which is maybe perhaps a little bit of a jarring title. It's certainly not subtle. White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. And the title "White Too Long" actually comes from, and it's actually the epigraph of the book. It comes from really an indictment from James Baldwin, an African American author, kind of really at his peak in the middle of the 20th century and into the civil rights movement. And he's writing. I'll give a bit of context, and I'll read the quote that it comes from. But the context is important. He's writing just a few months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And Bobby Kennedy, right? So at a very, very dark moment in the nation's history, where there had been such hopefulness, I think, and progress, really, with some civil rights acts being passed, some movements across the country, and then we have these leaders gunned down in the face of it. And I think he, like King, always held out some optimism that white Americans and white Christian Americans in particular would ultimately stand up en masse on the side of the civil rights movement. And I think when, in these months after King, when there was no great mass uprising of white Christians and whites overall, really standing up for these, it felt, I think, to many like the movement might die along with these leaders. He penned an op-ed in the New York Times, and so this quote is from this op-ed that he penned in the New York Times, where he was really quite at a moment of despair. But Baldwin was always, I think, his gift was really clarity, I think, and in holding a mirror up he to the nation. He actually talked about his work with a term that's really a Christian term. He talked about his work as bearing witness to the truth and trying to do that in an unflinching kind of way. So that's the context for this quote. So here it goes. I'll give you the longer version of the quote. I will flatly say that the bulk of this country's white population impresses me, and has so impressed me for a very long time, as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long. They have been married to the lie of white supremacy too long. The effect on their personalities, their lives, their grasp of reality has been as devastating as the lava which so memorably immobilized the citizens of Pompeii. They are unable to conceive that their version of reality, which they want me to accept, is an insult to my history and a parody of theirs, and an intolerable violation of myself. So, it's a very biting indictment, really, of the failure, I think, of whites and white Christians in particular to kind of stand up en masse on the side of civil rights for African Americans in the late 1960s. And in some ways, it's a good place to start, and why I actually named the book "White Too Long." One way of reading this book is really of a white Southern evangelical Christian, that's me, trying to pen a response 50 years later, to this indictment, and trying to give as honest an assessment as I can about where we are, where there's been progress, and where there's really so much work, still to do.
Right. Which comes kind of as a surprise to so many people, white people, who seem to think or like to think perhaps the church wasn't a part of this or we had moved beyond this. But you point out so many things in your book that are helpful. You talk about across the southern part of the United States, the Confederate monuments. For many people, a monument to the Confederacy is just simple historical marker. But you make the case that it's so much more than that. Help us understand sort of what's going on here that we may not comprehend, and how this history could be connected to events like the Tulsa Race Massacre that we know about here in our own locale.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right to tie them together. Things like a massive burning down of an entire, part of town, killing of hundreds, like random killing of hundreds of African Americans by their neighbors, right, doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so one of the things that we see is that, for example, in the 1920s, sort of late 19 teens and early 1920s, there were events like this all across the country. Tulsa's not alone in this. I'm actually working on a new book now that looks at these mass events of white mass racial violence perpetrated against African Americans, where it wasn't just a rogue Klan of the KKK, a dozen people in sheets, but it was actually mass mobilization of whites in the community against their African American neighbors. And in that book, I'm covering Tulsa, but I'm also covering 9 other cities in 9 other states that happened, between the 1870s and the 1930s. And in particular, the 19 teens and 20s was really one of the high points of violence against African Americans. It was also the high point of monument building, Confederate monument building in the U.S. And so you might think, okay, well, what do these two things have to do with each other? But they were really part of the same movement of whites across the country reasserting white supremacy, both through violence and through civic, kind of claiming civic space with these monuments to the Confederacy, which were, of course, kind of valorizing, this vision of society that really saw whites at the top of the social, political, cultural pyramid, and everyone else under it is very hierarchical. Very literally, the supremacy of whites is really what this vision was about, and I should say a God-intended vision of society, right? That was very tied to a Christian worldview and a Christian view of the world. I mean, when you would have ministers, performing prayers and leading the unveiling of these monuments. You would have church choirs from white Christian churches singing. At these big unveiling events, and some of them in Richmond, Virginia, in the early after 1900, again, not around the Civil War, but at an unveiling of Jefferson Davis, there were over 100,000 people that showed up, and included things like all the white children from the public schools and the local churches singing and being arrayed in a living Confederate flag, right, and singing patriotic songs and valorizing. The Christian ministers, Second Baptist Church in Richmond hosted the United Daughters of the Confederacy and others who were leading, these things. So these things were all intertwined. But I think it's important to remember. So, and what's going on in that time period is really whites reclaiming the law, instituting segregation, and a Jim Crow segregated world, segregated schools, segregated civic spaces after the gains of equality after the Civil War, right? It was overthrowing the gains of Reconstruction that went well into the 20s, that both these acts of violence and these acts of building monuments, all blessed and baptized by Christian ministers and churches across the country.
Right. Kind of shocking history for some of us if we weren't taught that in our schools, which I don't think most of us were, in terms of what was going on with all that. I think there's that great misconception that somehow there's just a couple of historical markers that were put up right after the Civil War, rather than this being sort of a whole movement to reassert the Confederacy and segregation and Black inequality and all those kind of things that swirled around as the legacy of slavery. So the way you describe that in the book, really helpful. You give so much detail to help understand that, and does put what happened in Tulsa in a greater context for us. You also talk about it.
One more point on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I make one more point on that? Just
sure.
Yeah, I mean, I actually have a chart in the book that I think was the most clarifying for me, that I actually built on data that the Southern Poverty Law Center collected. And so if you actually look at the number of kind of monuments erected in each year, what you see is actually there's some right around the Civil War and its aftermath, but the next big peak is in the 19-teens and 1920s, right? And again, you see that's the peak of kind of mass violence against African Americans in the country. It's a peak for monument building, and then it kind of subsides. And the next peak you see is after the passage of Brown v. Board of Education that desegregated public schools. You see another peak of Confederate monument building that happens in the 1950s. So it's just such a very clear sense of when segregation is threatened, when white supremacy is threatened. You see this spurt of activity of new monuments. And it's worth noting too, like, where did they get placed? Not in Confederate cemeteries, right? They got placed on town public squares, courthouse lawns, right? Big civic spaces claiming it for whites. And so, if you think about a small county seat town that's got a massive monument to the Confederacy on the courthouse grounds, what it's really declaring to all the African Americans who are going to walk into the courthouse trying to find justice, it's kind of it is a very overt declaration of what kind of justice they can expect to find.
Very good. Well, that's great insight. You also share, kind of use a framework in the book, The End of White Christian America, from Dr. Kubler-Ross's 5 Stages of Grief. And you use that to frame what's going on in America today. Would you describe how this applies and kind of where you think we are now in terms of how you frame that in the book?
Right. I was trying to think about how to understand where we are in the country. So I'll back up just a minute to kind of give you some of the background there. So one of the things that I looked at in that book, The End of White Christian America, it was a 2016 book, but it was looking at how the religious demographics of the country have dramatically changed just in the last few decades. So I think it's commonplace for people to say, this is a majority white Christian country. For all of American history, that has been basically true until now. And so what that book was kind of analyzing and looking at is that as recently as 2008, just a few election cycles ago, when Barack Obama was first running for president, the country was in fact still a majority white Christian country. So 54% of the country identified as white and Christian as recently as 2008. By the time we get to 2016, with the Trump-Clinton election, that number had dropped down to 47, right? So we had crossed this threshold from 54 to 47% white and Christian, of being a nation that was demographically speaking majority white and Christian to one that no longer was. And I think that key insight, right, and it was kind of the key to understanding, I think, some of the visceral appeal of Trump's campaign, when he would say things like, if you don't vote for me, America as you know it is going to be over, right? You'll never see another candidate like me again. It was this appeal to this crossing this threshold from being, a white Anglo-Saxon, mostly Protestant country to one that was no longer that. And so, I at the end of the book, I did tap Kubler-Ross's framework. And for those of you who don't know, she's someone who's used often in pastoral care and other kinds of end-of-life hospice settings to really help explain the kind of process that people go through when they get a terminal diagnosis, right? And that over her study of hospice patients, she came to see this kind of arc of responses there. And the one of the first couple of stages in that is when you get a bad kind of prognosis are really denial and anger, right? And these are really the kind of big kind of first two responses when you're first faced with a new reality. And I think that was actually pretty helpful for me in understanding the part of what's going on here. I think particularly among white Christians in the country, and who is it? There is a kind of visceral sense that they feel this shift in the country, and that shift involves them moving from majority to not a majority. There is no single group now that claims majority status, and that's a loss, right? For groups who had experienced themselves as being the unquestioned majority in the country. So I think these nostalgic appeals, even to the "Make America Great Again," right? It was that last word really that I think had a lot of the power and that tapped this moment that we're in, in the country. So I was kind of talking about that, and then the other stages really are a kind of disillusionment that happens so after you kind of get over the anger and the denial, there is this kind of like disillusionment that happens. I think we're seeing a lot of that. When we talk to people in focus groups and other kinds of research projects, we hear a lot of people saying like, well, I'm lost. I don't know what the country stands for anymore. That kind of thing, especially from white Christian Americans. At the end of that trail, if we get to a place of health, ultimately, there is a place of acceptance, right? And I don't think we're there yet, for sure. But I think that the things that we see, and particularly people going to links like to attack the U.S. Capitol, right? This is something that like is unprecedented in American history. But I think understanding that and understanding this angst, anxiety, anger really is partially because and even primarily because we've gone through this great shift, this sea change in who we are as a country and who we think we're going to be in the future.
Very helpful to understand sort of those dynamics and using Kubler-Ross's description of how we react to dramatic change. So appreciate that context you provide for us. I've recently read Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste. She has this thesis that caste, like the caste system in the continent of India, is a better description of the situation in America than simply racism. What would you think about that?
I think well, first of all, I should say, it's an elegant book. I mean, it's just so well informed. It's so well written. It's so creative, I think, in the framework, and I'm so impressed by, this lens, right, that she brings to kind of to help you see things a little differently. So I think it's a real achievement, that book, and certainly kind of recommend it to folks. Though I trip a little bit over whether it's better or not. I'm not so sure. I mean, the main reason I would say that is that I think it's a helpful lens, and partly because it's a new lens that Americans aren't really accustomed to thinking about caste, right? So I think the newness of that is helpful, right? Because it always helps you see things from a different perspective. I think that may also be its weakness, right? Is that it's not part of the vernacular, it's not part of the vocabulary that we kind of have discussions about. So for those who've read it, I think it is an illuminating lens. I think ultimately, though, it also has the upside of including things like economic status, as well as kind of race and ethnicity, kind of can haul all that together. But what's notable about it is just how persistent the sort of conceptions of race and racial identity are at the heart of, I think, the American context in particular. I think it just has to do with our particular, history of Native American disenfranchisement and African American slavery with African Americans. This is really the context that we're dealing with. One of the things I've been trying to do is to kind of hold on to the centrality of white Christianity and the role that it has played, there. And you could trace it back. This was helpful for me in terms of a lens. This version of white Christianity lands on our shores. Like, it doesn't get invented here. It's part of a legacy of European Christianity and conquest and domination that kind of comes baked in really, to the Christianity that just lands on these shores with white Christians arriving here. And one piece that I wish every white Christian would know about that very few do. And I'll say this: I made it all the way through seminary and a PhD program without myself knowing much about this thing called the doctrine of discovery, which is a late 15th century, like 1493, papal edict. But it is the thing that really built into the kind of modern era. It basically just said, look, that it said that if any Christians coming from Europe come upon lands that are occupied by non-Christian inhabitants, that you have the blessing of the church to seize those lands in the name of Christianity and the European state from which you're from, right? And it was a Christian blessing on conquest and denomination that was largely also based on race, right? Because most of those places were people with darker skin than Europeans, right? And that race got built in, particularly around skin tone, got built in to the DNA of Christianity. That's the Christianity we inherit in the U.S., and it was put to work very rapidly against Native American populations. It was put to work very rapidly as kind of the cornerstone of justifying slavery, and enslaving people from Africa and bringing them here. It was very much a part of the Christian worldview that the country was built on.
Fascinating. We don't always get all of this history, whether it's church history or other kind of history, until we look a little deeper into some of these issues. And you're certainly giving us a frame and a lens to see some of that. Another thing you frame in your book, Quite Too Long, is how we look at terrorism. And you talk some about how we judge domestic terrorism compared to Islamic terrorism. Would you say more about that and kind of explain what you're seeing there?
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying, it's one of the things that really influenced me to put pen to paper and to write this book was, in fact, an event of white Christian terrorism. Now, the media didn't report it that way, but it was the event in 2015 of Dylan Roof, walking into a Mother Emanuel AME church, an African-American church in Charleston, and gunning down 9 people while they were at Bible study. The media reported him as certainly, he had statements saying he wanted to start a race war, that he was a clear white supremacist. But what the media often left out was that he was also a church-going Lutheran, right? An ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. That's a mainline Protestant denomination, not even an evangelical one, but a mainline Protestant denomination. That he was a member in good standing at an ELCA church, had grown up in the church. And the other piece that really struck me, in fact, it's the only picture I have in the book, is a full page thing that he wrote in a journal that he had in prison while he was awaiting trial. He drew amidst the words that were his kind of screed about why he wanted to start a race war and why white Christians and whites needed to stand up and be more militant and violent. In between all of those words, interspersed throughout the journal, were Christian symbols and drawings. He had more than a dozen crosses that he had just doodled in the margins of the journal. And he had a full page cross on one page with rain coming down. And the one that I feature in the book is a full picture of a white Jesus emerging from the tomb, a pencil drawing that he had. And if you look at the drawing, what struck me about it is that it's no neophyte drawing. It's not a novice drawing. He's got a halo around his head, the way that medieval artists, a lot of and Renaissance artists portray Jesus in paintings. He's got Christian symbols in there, so he knows what he's doing, right? It's not just kind of a kind of novice here. It's someone who's deeply informed by Christianity, and the fact that to get to your question, I think the fact that no one really talked about him as a white Christian terrorist, I think is really notable. All right. Certainly, if someone had walked into that same church claiming to do it in the name of Islam, we certainly wouldn't be talking about that as a radical Islamic terrorist act, but we didn't put the same label on that. And at PRRI, we do a lot of public opinion surveying, in kind of the hat that I wear in my day job. And we actually decided to test this out to see whether people had a double standard here. And so we asked people on a national public opinion survey, if someone does something in the name of Islam, so commits a violent act in the name of Islam, do you think they're really Muslim or not? And then we asked another group, if someone commits a violent act in the name of Christianity, do you think they're really Christian or not? And what we found was indeed a double standard, that people were much more likely, Americans overall, much more likely to say, yep, that's really a Muslim, than they were to say, yes, that's really a Christian.
Right. The difficulty for any group who doesn't know very much about another group of the nuance of the differences within the group, we so often gloss over. So like in this case, an instance of Islamic terrorism or terrorism that we see from a Muslim, we make this gross generalization that represents all of Islam. But when a person does it in the name of Christianity, Christians especially say, oh no, that's not us. That's not real Christianity. That's not what we represent, which may be true, but it just does illustrate that kind of double standard and in a way, a lack of knowledge of the other, whether it's a person of a different race or ethnicity or religion. I
think it's notable that what we often want to do is to take the best example from our religion and compare it to the worst example from somebody else's, right? And that we think that that's a fair comparison, right? So we trot out our best examples and we trot out the worst examples on the other side. It's certainly never fair. I mean, so I think Dylan Roof actually should stand forever. As long as this generation is living and breathing. If you want to pull out the worst of someone else's religion, you better be willing to put Dylan Roof on the table right beside them. As an example of a kind of white Christian terrorist, as well. And I think one other point I'll make here, I think the real danger for white Christians, and I say this as a white Christian, is to, and I hear this a lot actually in people responding to the book and in discussions, is, the statement, well, you can't be Christian and racist. You can't be a follower of Jesus and be racist, like as if that's a statement of historical fact, right? Now I know what people mean when they say that, right? And they want to say, look, if you truly understand the teachings of Jesus, you couldn't possibly be racist, I think is what they really mean. But when these worst examples come out, I think this like no true Christian could do X, right? Is an easy way to kind of get us out of, I think, the difficult wrestling with the fact that no, actually, we need to kind of resist the urge to say that's not us. That we really do have to say, okay, like what does it mean that someone who is raised and a practicing Christian could think it is part of their Christianity to gun down 9 African American fellow Christians? How does that work? And it's also easy to dismiss it as kind of the act of one kind of crazy person. But if you look at the larger history and you look at Tulsa and you look at the other, Tulsa 1921, and you look at other events in history, you really do have to kind of, the words I've often used, you have to sit with it, right? And I think you have to kind of sit in this very uncomfortable place and realizing that this religion that you value and has brought so much meaning to your own life has also been used in some fairly nefarious ways. And if we're really thinking about our responsibility to the present and to our kids and grandchildren, we can't brush that aside. Like we really do have to kind of do the work, I think, to prevent that from living among us for another generation.
Right. So part of our lecture series, obviously this year, is looking toward that 100th anniversary and kind of doing our own work as whites, particularly as white Christians, in terms of the history and the legacy of how racism and white supremacy has been tied in and supported by Christian and by churches, by Christian leaders. You sketched all that out for us in the book as well as in your opening lecture. But you've also done some research about those same attitudes and how they're alive today. so many of us who are Christians, like to think that our faith insulates us somehow from holding any kind of prejudicial or racist attitude. Especially we think that about people who attend worship regularly, who are faithful to their local faith community. But you say you found actually the opposite of that in your research. So tell us about what you found and the prevalence of these kind of attitudes that are current in America, even as we speak.
Yeah, well, the other thing that I wanted to do in the book, besides sketch, this very troubling history, was to look and to ask the question. I was like, okay, well, that's the history. Where are we now, and where how does this history play out? And so, the best tool for doing that is to kind of look at current public opinion data. And so, kind of tapping some large public opinion surveys conducted by PRRI. Looking at, in particular, questions around race, racism, systemic and structural racism, things like Confederate flags or the killing of unarmed African-American men by police, criminal justice system, and looked at a whole range of questions there. And what was really striking is how consistent the patterns were across a whole range of different questions that had to do with race and racism in the country. I'll give you just a couple of examples, here. So, on the couple of questions that have been, in the news the past year or so, the one is just on Confederate flags and monuments. We've been talking about that. We asked about whether people saw Confederate flags and monuments as more of a symbol of Southern pride or more a symbol of racism. And in the book, what I try to do is compare the responses of white Christian subgroups to the responses of whites who claim no religious affiliation, because I really wanted to see what work is Christianity doing in shaping the attitudes of white Americans, and then compare that to the attitudes of African Americans as well, and kind of see where things fell out. And on question after question after question, this basic pattern fell out that that white Christians, and not just evangelicals, it was white mainline Protestants like Episcopalians, United Methodists, and others, and white Catholics as well, all scored fairly high on a composite measure that I put together, and I called the racism index. And just to give you kind of a couple of concrete examples, we asked about the Confederate flag, more a symbol of Southern pride, symbol of racism. White Christians across the board, again, not just evangelical, but mainline and Catholic, were 30 percentage points more likely than whites who were religiously unaffiliated to say that the Confederate flag is more a symbol of Southern pride than a symbol of racism. When we asked about the killing of unarmed African-American men by police, for example, again, white Christian subgroups across the board, about 25 percentage points more likely than religiously unaffiliated whites to say the killing of unarmed African-American men by police are isolated incidents rather than part of a pattern of how police treat African-Americans. And on question after question, we found this same pattern. And essentially, when we combined it all together into this single index that I scored on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 holding the most racist attitudes, white evangelicals scored 8 out of 10 on that scale, but white mainline Protestants, scored 7 out of 10, and white Catholics also scored 7 out of 10. Whites who claim no religious affiliation only scored 4 out of 10, much closer to where African Americans are at 2 out of 10 on the same scale. So if one way it's kind of boiling all this down is that if you take the average kind of white person in America and you add Christian identity, they move up the scale into higher scores on the racism index rather than lower. That's certainly the opposite that I think most church people would think. And then I did actually test specifically for the effects of attending church, and because you could say, well, maybe this is just about people who are Christian in name only. They're not really connected to church. They're not listening to sermons. They're not part of Sunday school or Bible study or any other kind of discipleship programs. So maybe they're just kind of claiming the label without being connected. But even when I looked at this response about or this pattern of behavior about being connected to a church, I found that overall among whites that attending churches made no difference one way or the other, but particularly among white evangelical Protestants. it actually made things worse. In other words, attending the relationship between holding racist attitudes and identifying as white evangelical was actually stronger among those who attended church more frequently than it was among those who attended church less frequently. And it led me to this kind of conclusion. It was one of these sentences that I wrote, and after I wrote it, I sort of stared at it because I was just so stunned that it is in fact what the data showed. And I basically said, look, one way of thinking about kind of summing this up in plain language is, if you were recruiting, kind of a hypothetical situation, if you were recruiting for a white supremacist organization and you want to increase your odds of being successful, you'd be better off hanging out in a local church parking lot on a Sunday than approaching whites who were sitting out services in the local coffee shop.
Such a stunning finding for those of us who are committed Christians. To think that somehow our faith and our theology in America of Christianity has been co-opted by white supremacy. But you make a similar statement in the book where you write that racism has indeed warped our own identities. So say more about that in terms of what you've found overall in the research you've been doing.
Yeah, I kind of go back to the quote we started off with from Baldwin here. He has this kind of line that runs through his work actually about how, either the tacit or explicit acceptance of this lie that whites are somehow inherently more valuable, the lives of whites are inherently more valuable than others, and how just allowing that to live within our theology, within our churches, within our psyches, warps everything around us, right? It warps our ability to see things rightly. And I think that quote, he said, their version of reality, which they want me to accept, is an insult to my history, a parody of theirs, right? And an intolerable violation of myself. And I think that it's easier, I think, for whites and white Christians to accept that there's been harm done, right, to African Americans. I mean, you can look all around, everything from criminal justice patterns of who's incarcerated, who is on death row, who even in COVID, like which communities are getting hit the hardest, right? It's African American, Latino communities, the Native American communities that are getting hit the hardest. Those have been communities that have suffered the brunt of white supremacy in this country, and whites are being affected much less. By the pandemics. I mean, in many ways, it's laid the results of this bare for us to see. But I think that's an easier thing for even whites of goodwill to accept. I think what came late to me even is the ways in which this, again, kind of tacit or just implicit acceptance. We're born into it because it's been part of our culture. This just kind of tacit sense that our lives are worth more than others, and should be. There's a kind of entitlement piece, to this as well. It warps everything around us. It warps our theology. It warps our relationships with others. And I think that sense that, to live more faithfully in the world, to be a kind of more authentic witness, if you put it in Christian language, to what God wants to do in the world, we can't do that as long as that's living, in our psyches. And there's a way in which it is distorted our vision, our moral vision, and our worldview. And so there's something in it, I kind of get to this at the end of the book. This is not an altruistic project we're talking about here. I mean, on the one hand, like, yes, we owe, there are things that we owe our African-American brothers and sisters based on this history. That's absolutely right. But there are things we owe our children and grandchildren too, I think, if we're really going to play the role we should play. I've been challenging white audiences and white Christian audiences, let's be the last generation that allows white supremacy to live inside our churches, our homes, and our psyches. Like, let's be the last one, right? But we're inheriting hundreds of years of this in our theologies and our culture. It's going to take some hard, heavy lifting to make that work. And I think it's going to take it happening. And so I'm so happy to be here and talking with you. It's going to be at the local level is where it's really going to happen, where we're sitting face to face with people that we know, we rub shoulders with, we're neighbors with, because there's a kind of accountability in that, right? That there isn't if you're kind of way up here on Twitter or social media or whatever. But I think facing it together, I think is because it's going to take some courage and some accountability for us to get there.
Yeah, I think in terms of the theology, it's difficult for white Christians to see when a theology says something like, you're a beloved child of God, and you're sitting in a congregation that's exclusively made up of white people, and you live in a neighborhood made up of white people. It's hard to see how that plays into racism. It sounds like just a positive message rather than something that implicitly is saying, but if you're not in this group, you're maybe not a beloved child of God. You maybe are not very important. Maybe you are, someone who we can treat however we want. Maybe we don't even see you as a part of love your neighbor as yourself because we see you as less valuable to begin with. But that implicit bias or that structured racism that we're kind of born into, I think does make it difficult to sort of ferret that out in our own psyches and our own theology. Certainly you help us see some of that in the book where you unpack sort of the evangelical theological package of being having a personal savior as Jesus sort of sets aside any kind of social justice component if all you focus on is your own personal relationship or those just within your own church or your own denomination. It's interesting stuff. We'll talk more about some of that in lecture 3 in our dialogue as we're looking at future possibilities. But before we leave today, let me ask you, just one other question, again, from some of the work you did in your book. You write about, you make this statement: continued racial inequality, injustice, and unrest harm our ability to live together in a democratic society. So did you have specific harms in mind in regard to democratic practices in terms of how this racism and white supremacy damages the democratic project here?
Yeah, well, we've had some stuff right out of the headlines. We saw it. I think the fact that we saw Confederate flags and Christian flags marching side by side in the attacks on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, I think is one way that we see this eroding our ability, this kind of sense of, and again, I think it boils down to, and the thing that I hope white Christians can move beyond, because I think if we don't, it really, no kidding and not trying to kind of be, alarmist, but I think it is the death knell of our democracy. If white Christians cannot let go of this sense that we white Anglo-Saxon Protestants own and are the country, if we cannot let go of that, that is the end of our democracy, right? We have kind of been able to kind of hold on to that for all of this time through the country, but the country really is changing in a way where we can no longer just give lip service to these ideals of religious liberty and pluralism and diversity, but it's with us today, and it's a real challenge, I think, and it can be a real achievement for this generation, because in some ways, in really truth, we are the first generation to face a country that is no longer majority white and Christian, right? And so if you think about, I'll end with an image that I used kind of at the end of White Christian America, if you picture America as a kind of table, like a dining room table, it helps. And because I think that, so I have an antique dining room table in my dining room downstairs. And you can even see some of this hierarchy even built into our architecture of even our furniture. So that table has 6 chairs, but one of the chairs is different than all the others. Right, it is bigger than the others, and it has arms. None of the other chairs have arms. It's called the captain's chair, right? In architectural terms, and it was designed for the father figure, right? This to sit and preside in a place of authority over dinner, right? That was like what that built in, what that was kind of representing in that furniture. And I think that's the way that white Christians have thought about America, right? Is that we have been sitting in the captain's chair, and we have been graciously inviting other people. This is the story we tell about ourselves. We've been graciously inviting other people to pull up a chair, gradually, and take a part around the table. But at the end of the day, we have known that we have owned the table. And I think this generation is the first one that cannot own the table, right? And the real question is, do we have it in us to pull up a chair in an equal way with other people, not demand to be the host, not demand that we own the table, but pull up a chair in an equal way, right? And to rethink this idea of America, right? That is not America as something we are and we own, and other people are just second-class citizens. And by the way, this is not something that's just like an evangelical thing. FDR, right, who many people think of as a fairly progressive, figure in American history, infamously said, "This is a white Protestant country, and everybody else is here by sufferance." Right. So this has come from the left and the right. But I think it is an idea that if we don't get over, it will be the end of our democracy. And so I think we have a real responsibility for creating a new image of what that means. And it's going to mean letting go of this idea of white supremacy, this lie that our lives are worth more than others, so that we can embrace, I think, the ideals of the country. One of my favorite quotes from Baldwin, I'm going to wrap with this, is, he said, if we can find the courage and love to finally face this problem, these are his words, we can end the racial nightmare, we can achieve our country, and we can change the history of the world.
Wow. So you've introduced us to some pretty shocking and stunning research and insights. We really appreciate it. We'll leave it on that more positive note about where we might go. We'll pick that up in our next lecture, next dialogue, session 3, in terms of possibilities and where we might be able to go if we want to respond in a healthier way and build better race relations in our country. So thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for being with us and sharing your insights. Really been fascinating. You've given us a lot to think about, and we'll look forward to the next segment.
Thanks, Reverend Wiggs. Happy to be here.